in here working with the Section 8 with whatever type of voucher, you can't get no help. They give you these bogus numbers. You can call, but so much your fingers fall off. Come on. No brokers to move out of here. There's no brokers. No one's helping. I want to get out of here. So she was also sort of dispelling this myth, right, that people stay in the shelter because they want to and because they think it's like, that they can get almost a freebie, right, for housing. So it's clearly not the case in her case. So there are also challenges with education. Youth residing in the shelter were traveling, as I mentioned, approximately an hour to school, and again, only a third of those students or youth reported that they were in the same school that they were prior to residing in the shelter. So Lisa, a shelter staff member, was kind of expressing her concern or sharing the struggles that she's noticed with families with regards to choosing their school. And she said, if parents are coming from like the Northern Bronx, that's the kids' school, and that the kids' schools are in the Northern Bronx, it's a decision of whether they want their kid to take a subway 2 hours or if they want to move their kid's school. It's not an easy choice. Most parents move their kids' schooling here if they're found eligible to stay here, and they know it's going to be longer than just a couple months. They'll move their kids' school here. And it's worth noting that this particular shelter was in Brooklyn, and kind of deep Brooklyn, so it was very, very possible that it would have been a 2-hour train ride from where they were in the shelter to their old school. So we asked about rules that they had to follow, but also how hard it was, again, for them to follow those rules. And so these are the means of how, that they expressed in terms of how hard it was for each of the first 3 rules that they mentioned. And you can see the one thing I want to point out is that for youth and caregivers, overall, they didn't really feel that it was that difficult, right, to follow rules. However, qualitatively, they expressed a lot of frustration with the rules and expressed a lot of challenges with the rules. So, it's in a way they were saying, I can follow rules. I don't have a problem following rules. It's the rules themselves that are a challenge and don't seem to make sense, right? And are not always helpful. So, but in addition, the staff response was interesting because they expressed that, or conveyed that it was hard, they perceived that it was harder, or that it was hard for residents to follow rules. So that kind of contrast is kind of an example of how there can be potentially conflicts, right, between residents and staff. And so these are some of the rules that the staff, caregivers, and youth noticed that they had to follow. So I'll just again highlight a few. So the curfew came up, signing in and out came up, fraternizing, which can mean having sexual relationships with residents. Smoking came up a lot, actually, which was interesting. And the 9 p.m. curfew for children. So there was definitely a desire for greater autonomy. And that came up in this quote here, when again, trying to kind of dispel this myth that people want to stay in shelters because they think it's great, right? So Cheryl, a caregiver, said, so I mean, we think, oh, this is utopia. Nobody wants to move. There's not one person in here, Nisha, who can't wait to get away from here. Every time I come home and I go over to the desk to sign, it's just like, oh my God, that hits home, right? The signing in. And I've been afraid to ask my kids because I wonder if they feel the same way too. Sunshine, a staff member, was also talking about how the rule that residents have to come back within 48 hours if they leave the shelter or they lose their spot, and was saying how that definitely proves to be a challenge for families when they are trying to travel and see family, or if it's over the holidays. And so she said they just need more time to be with their family. That's something that they can approve, especially around the holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, those 2 holidays. I just think, hey, let's give them 3 or 4 days, because what are they going to do here? You know what I'm saying? There I just hope that things improve, because they're here and it's a lot of stress for them. There is the desire for greater autonomy also came up in this focus group with caregivers, where they were expressing frustration about their units getting inspected. So one caregiver said, they be in my unit 24/7. My daughter only goes to the after-school program and that's it. I don't feel safe or comfortable in here. Like as soon as I wake up, I got the attitude, because I'm here. Staff, they do what they want to do, when they want to do it. They control whatever they want to control, when they want to control it. But they don't even have no control over it, you understand? I mean, it's hard to tell. So this desire for greater autonomy is also very prevalent in the minds of youth as well. When I asked the question of what could be done to improve the shelter, one male youth said more freedom. And the female youth in the focus group responded by saying it should be just like a regular building. But some shelters do that though, because my grandma used to live in a shelter, and in her shelter, like you don't have to sign out or nothing, and you could bring people upstairs. Do you feel like that was better than this one? So as I mentioned, 44% of youth reported that there was nothing for people their age to do in the shelter. And Mark, a shelter staff member, kind of expressed why he thought it was so important for there to be things for youth to do in the shelters. And he said, you've got to always have not just one person, but like 2 or 3 people that's always checking up on them. Coming through, people want to be loved and noticed. That's why they do a lot of the outbreaks and stuff that they do, because they're trying to be noticed and loved. They don't feel like they're really getting that. So that's why they use the drugs and act a certain way, you know what I mean? Just to get attention or whatever. So as I mentioned, it seemed as if homelessness could be taking a greater toll on youth than caregivers. And so we see here that 44% of youth felt unsafe inside the shelter versus 35% of the caregivers. 89% of youth felt that bad things happen in the shelter. So if you can think about that for a moment, that's almost 90% of them saying that they don't feel safe in the place where they're living, right? And 69% of caregivers said the same thing. Youth reported that on average, greater mental health symptomology related relative to caregivers. The homelessness, again, taking a toll on youth. And Rachel, a caregiver, was sharing her story about what it's like to live in the shelter with a schizophrenic bipolar child. And she said, the challenge with us, a bipolar schizophrenic child, is how the shelter, his nerves is worse, his impatience is worse. He can't stay in here. He feel like that anything he does, they're always going to say something to him. It's worse than we've been here for almost 4 years, and it's bad for him. That he got to come in, sign out every day. He can't go where he wants to go, spend the night where he wants to spend the night. He can't be a teenager, and that's hard for a teenager. So male youth also here were kind of talking about how this stress may lead to substance use for some. So in this focus group, this one male youth said, we can't speak for other people because we know we are not knowing if people, how their life story was. Stress, you know what I mean? Take away the stress. Take away their thinking about their problems. What might take away that stress? Are you saying the drug use might help take it away? Yeah, I mean, for some people. So how are we doing on time? We good? Okay. Perfect. Okay. So what have we been doing about homelessness? So in recent events related to homelessness in New York City, at least in 2022, Mayor Eric Adams allotted $171 million for outreach efforts and specialized resources for safe havens, stabilization beds, and drop-in centers. But unfortunately, around the same time, they were also conducting sweeps of homeless encampments. And there were several accounts of city workers trashing belongings of residents, and the use of NYPD counterterrorism, the counterterrorism department, to enforce these or to carry these out also proved to obviously be a huge point of contention. And so you have a picture here of one of the camps being cleaned out, the NYPD taking the tents and moving the belongings. So from 2022 to 2023, there is also a 75% increase in the shelter population due to newly arrived migrants seeking asylum with little or no support from the federal government. And I've been hearing that you guys experienced some of that as well, right? That's not to say that if the migrants hadn't come in that we would not have a homelessness crisis, because we know that we have and we do. And it's just to point out that this was, in the news and something that was real and happening. And in response to that, one of the things that the mayor did was to request to suspend the right to shelter mandate. But after a lot of back and forth with advocates, there was a settlement with the Coalition for the Homeless and the Legal Aid Society in March of 2024. And this past spring, or June, you may have heard that with the Supreme Court at a national level, they issued their opinion in Grants Pass versus Johnson, for federal legislation which essentially criminalized homelessness and allowed those who are residing in public spaces to be arrested. There is continued understaffing and lack of budget support for housing agencies, and only 16,000 out of the 25,000 planned apartments were built or preserved between July 2021 and June 2022. The city rent vouchers to transition into permanent housing has reached its lowest level in 5 years, and a growing number of eviction cases have also been occurring, in addition to underfunding the Housing First initiatives. So what should we do about family homelessness and homelessness in general? We can streamline PATH services to be less disruptive for parents and children during episodes of homelessness by putting a PATH office in each borough, for example, and of course, which would reduce wait times at PATH. A lot more resources to DHS to be able to provide more support in finding permanent housing in addition to shelter housing, and to raise the minimum wage as a means of preventing episodes of homelessness. We can also eliminate or change the current DHS rule, which does not allow residents to be out of the housing for more than 48 hours. When you think about the quality of life and living in a shelter, preserving the right to shelter mandate as well. It was largely preserved with that settlement, with the exception of asylum seekers in New York, single asylum seekers in New York City. Expand access to city FEPs and create more affordable housing. At the shelter level, we could continue to bolster and expand trauma-informed care and shelters more broadly, given the extent of trauma experienced. Larger units for families with adolescents and children. More after-school programming for youth and school, and more infrastructure within shelters to provide spaces for children of all ages to play. And going back to the kind of after-school programming, if you noticed in the slide with the services, there were both after-school care and youth programming, or not youth programming, but after-school programming and childcare in both shelters, and it proved to be a godsend for them as well. There is an increase in support of services related to, there could be an increase in supportive services related to employment and education. and more infrastructure within the shelters to provide space for all children. Implementing peer mentorship programs, I think with youth residing in shelters is something that I'm interested in. And given how I was saying that there are very far and few between and don't get a lot of attention, shelters could foster informal support and more in-house access to substance use treatment, which is occurring. There's definitely in New York City been a real effort to expand naloxone and expand access to treatment in a real way. So that's exciting. And the last thing I wanted to say is that, expand that informal support network, if you're going to live in the shelter, I think is a really, really crucial and helpful thing to leverage. These families really are gaining support from one another, and fostering that can be really helpful. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. It was very interesting and really kind of disturbing. My question, you suggested that mental health, housing is mental health. And I've always wondered which comes first. Is it the mental health that causes the problem, or the not having housing that causes the mental health issues? And when thinking about it, perhaps one or the other would guide your intervention or strategies for it. It looked like your statistics showed that there were some interventions that might work. But listening to the stories, I'm not so sure. So how efficacious is providing housing, and is it sustainable for addressing mental health issues? I don't know, is that question?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. So the question was related to efficacy of addressing mental health, right, through housing itself. Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, and it's a great one. And I think it really, I think it depends on whether you are starting with mental health issues, right? I think if you are starting with mental health issues, housing alone may not obviously solve all of your problems, right? Or address those mental health issues, I should say. But if you don't necessarily, you might be struggling with certain things, but don't necessarily have severe or significant mental health issues prior to becoming homelessness, that experience can definitely obviously be very triggering and stressful, especially for a parent. And so I think that that both are definitely needed, but I think that the key with the housing first model, which is I think what you're getting at, right, is that it's more about not requiring those who may benefit from those services from getting those services in order to maintain their housing, right? So it's about saying, like, you don't have to go to therapy if you want to keep this housing. You don't have to go to substance use treatment in order to keep your housing, right? And what that can look like is, it can be jarring to some, but what that can look like is you walking into a shelter and someone has a unit that in the shelter, and it's clear when you enter it that they have a hoarding problem, for example, or struggling with hoarding, right? But they're not kicked out. They're not necessarily reprimanded for it, and they are known to be an active user of crack, but they're not using in the shelter. And so it can look like, that's what it can look like, right? But they have housing, and they may have been living there for years and years and years, and that's home to them, and that's kind of that support is what allows them to live a somewhat dignified life, right? So.
Thank you. I'm going to hit you with a couple questions. First, when it comes to the shelter rules, who what does it play? Is it the shelter itself, state policy, any kind of federal law, an advisory board, people who are donating? So that's question one. Question two, in your study, you had about 3/4 female caregivers, about 3/4 male youth. And I don't know if that's something that you think is extremely common, or is this just a sampling, like it's a sampling anomaly? And particularly with the mental health issue, if that also plays a big role with this difference in sex. And then number three, promise, last one, when you've brought up mentioned the migrant situation at the end in New York City, certainly felt it here in Chicago. And given that there are so many people there who still have that, especially that disillusionment with government services, they already have that at top of mind. And we heard a lot of negatives about things when people coming in as migrants. But were there certain positives or certain lessons that you can grab and kind of push more for policies? Because when there were so many constraints, something had to be done, and there are certain things there that could actually maybe be used in the future in a more positive manner.
Okay. Thank you for all your questions. I may need you to jog my memory about them as I go through them. So the first one that I'm remembering is the one related to caregivers and youth. Right. And yeah, so I guess it sounds cliche, but it's the reality. I mean, a lot of the caregivers in the shelters were female. So that is pretty representative of what the shelter kind of overall sample probably was, even though it was a small sample. The youth, though, that's an interesting question, because I thought about that myself. My thought is that the parents of females may have been more reluctant to allow their female children to participate, because they may have been more protective of them, and understandably, and we're kind of not very known to them, although we were able to kind of eventually build a rapport with them. That might have been what's going on, because I wouldn't imagine that there would be any reason, right, for families with female youth to be less common than families with male youth. But great question.
The shelter rules, who's setting
Oh,
them?
right, the shelter rules. So I would say that those who are setting those rules are all of the above. And that's part of the challenge, right? So they're having to kind of follow sort of, in some ways, federal rules to a certain degree. They're having to follow shelter rules to a certain degree, and at the city level, like DHS, right? And then the shelters themselves, I think the way those are enforced and particular rules that are enforced, and the way the particular director handles things of the shelter, I think can come into play as well.
And then the last one was migrant crush constraints, pop-ups, lessons that could be applied in the future.
Yeah.
There were anything positive enough.
The migrant.
So given the constraints that everyone really faced, New York City in particular, what were maybe positive lessons or things that you can push on? If you're able to do a pop-up shelter because migrants are being bussed in, are there certain things that now we should be able to get that just on a regular basis, whether it's pop-up shelters closer to schools or that type of thing?
Oh, right. Okay. So the question's related to what can be done for pop-up shelters with migrants, or? Oh, right. Yes. I mean, off the top of my head, I would say fostering that community again. So, for example, like within the shelter, and I don't know if this is what you're getting at or helps to answer your question, but I think the caregivers really find a way of coping with their situation from bonding with one another. And so I imagine in a similar way that families in pop-up shelters would benefit from that as well. I think in terms of concrete services, if that's sort of more what you're thinking about, I think it can be, it's difficult and for sure. And I think a lot of the same challenges remain, and and I'm not in maybe some of the same solutions are also applicable. I think that there are even more challenges, obviously, because they are having probably language and cultural barriers that are huge. But I think creating that community is a start, and co-locating services and bringing services to those pop-up shelters, I think is probably a good approach, right? So bringing education and activities and support to them, yeah.
Excellent presentation, and you reminded me that the system really needs disruption because it's so broken. And the answer would be, everybody gets Section 8 vouchers. And what I would like to do is to have everyone who has a Section 8 go to their alderman or their congressman, and they don't leave the office till they give them housing in that district. Because we have deliverables with waiting lists to nowhere. And so don't send the individuals under duress to things that don't exist, and hold people accountable. Like, I really want to know who got what in that reported budget of the mayor, because there's a lot of funds that community people, that non-for-profits, that others could do. I even don't know if the simple solution is this. Any building that's abandoned in the community, whether it's a storefront property, an old grocery store, an old hospital, you can have vouchers from Habitat for Humanity and develop the housing. And you just stop the nonsense of waiting 20 years for housing, so you hear generations of families who don't have that. And my question is, why is that so hard? Do we need to do guerrilla politics so it's not that obvious? And then I'll end with a different comment, but I want to ask you, do we need to do disruption and guerrilla politics?
Wow. Thank you for that question. And I share your frustration for sure about the lack of affordable housing to start with. And also, I think, as many of you are probably aware, even if you get the voucher, it's often not accepted by many of the apartments that are supposed to accept them. And so I think that might be one area to look at in terms of, better connecting them, is to require have more enforcement of that and of accepting those vouchers. Yeah, in terms of a strategy for responding, I mean, I think I do research, but I also really appreciate advocacy, and really think that it's critical and important. And I think that bringing stories to life of families can be a critical or a helpful tool in doing that, and sharing those stories, I think, with lawmakers, I think is really important.
Share with you one truth to power story. Everyone in this room has probably heard about Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray was the young adult in Baltimore thrown into a police van and had lethal head and spinal cord injuries for teaching him a lesson on a ride after he was picked up. Okay, and the city of Baltimore had riots, and the community was ready to burn down the central business district, let alone the football and the baseball stadium. This is Freddie Gray's story. Freddie Gray was one of twins who came more than 12 weeks early. His sister died in the neonatal intensive care at University of Maryland. because of necrotizing enterocolitis, a common complication of prematurity. Freddie survived. He never got early intervention. He lived in dilapidated housing. He got lead poisoning and was homeless. I'm not done with Freddie. Freddie did not get preschool, did not get Head Start, showed up at school and they were shocked that he wasn't ready for kindergarten. Never got any services, never got any mentoring. At age 10, was discovered to be 4 grades behind in academics, and they said, you know, we can't help you. At which point Freddie says, school is not for me. My friends on the street are my community. That's what I'll do. The impact of not addressing Freddie's needs, homelessness, and other things cost the city of Baltimore $5 billion because of stupidity and neglect. There are many more Freddies that aren't as dramatic, but the larger political system says this is impossible. It's not. There are ways to do this, but as long as housing isn't a fundamental deliverable, and there are waiting lists to nowhere, as long as health is not a fundamental deliverable, as long as behavioral health is not equitably served by the health system, we can expect many more Freddies.
Yeah.
Okay, we're at the end of our time today, so let's thank our speaker for today.